document in the chat with selected poems from Pauli Murray. And basically, the way this is gonna go will be similar to if anyone's done a poetry workshop where we'll look at least three. There are more than three poems on this document, but at least three poems, and we'll read them each twice out loud, and then we'll respond to imagery, to what the imagery evokes in us, etc. We'll be looking at the poems pretty in depth. But before that, I want to read. I'll read a quote from the introduction to the collection of Pauli Murray's poems, Dark Testament. And this introduction is by Elizabeth Alexander, and this is a little bit from the intro about why poetry. Why was poetry part of this person's life? Why was Pauli Murray doing poetry along with all this civil rights work, all this legal work, all this eventually, ministerial work? What did poetry bring? And let me know if you can't open that document in the chat. Great. I put it in again, just in case anyone came after I put it in. The poetry of Pauli Murray. Why and how poetry? Murray faced and explored the interior space between certainty and uncertainty, and poetry allowed her to be in those spaces without contradiction. The law seems to promise certainty, the pleasure and reward of a set of powerful tools, and that is one way to go about making change. But I think Murray was interested in self simultaneously in and outside of gender constraints. Poetry was where she could imagine herself into other identities and experiences. In deeply imagined persona poems, Murray brought her readers into the experience of lynching and other forms of racial violence. She illuminated the courage of young people in the face of such demonic opposition and seemingly impassable straits. Sometimes in doing the work of political struggle, we do not pause long enough in the human stories themselves. Murray used poetry as a tool to slow down and experience deeply what it means to be among the most vulnerable and the most resilient. Murray's experience of gender was not fixed by social norms, and her admission and embrace of her gender fluidity was highly unusual in her times. How she lived in gender surfaces the deepest human questions. Who am I? What do I desire? How am I oriented? Where is my sun, my North Star? In her poetry, we see the Pauli Murray who experienced curiosity without certainty, beyond the societal definitions. For a person so uncannily accomplished, with such tremendous capacity to improve the conditions of others, her poems are an argument for the need for an introspective and expressive self-practice in order to best do the work of public-facing justice advocacy. By Elizabeth Alexander from the introduction to Dark Testament and Other Poems. So I thought we would start off by looking at this poem, Mr. Roosevelt Regrets from 1943. And I'm wondering if someone would volunteer to read this poem, and then we'll have someone else read it just so that we can hear it from different voices. So who would be willing to read this poem first?
Okay.
I will. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Thanks, Dustin.
What'd you get, black boy, when they knocked you down in the gutter and they kicked your teeth out and they broke your skull with clubs and they bashed your stomach in? What'd you get when the police shot you in the back and they chained you to the beds while they wiped the blood off? What'd you get when you cried out to the top man, when you called on the man next to God, so you thought, and you asked him to speak out to save you. What'd the top man say, black boy? Mr. Roosevelt Regrets.
Thanks, Dustin. Jennifer, do you want to read it again?
Sure.
And this time, let's also read the little intro-y part.
Thing? Sure. Mr. Roosevelt Regrets, Detroit Riot, 1943. Upon reading PM Newspaper's account of Mr. Roosevelt's statement on the recent race clashes, I share your feelings that the recent outbreaks of violence in widely spread parts of the country endanger our national unity and comfort our enemies. I am sure that every true American regrets this. What'd you get, black boy, when they knocked you down in the gutter and they kicked your teeth out and they broke your skull with clubs and they bashed your stomach in? What'd you get when the police shot you in the back and they chained you to the beds while they wiped the blood off? What'd you get when you cried out to the top man? When you called on the man next to God, so you thought, and you asked him to speak out to save you? What'd the top man say, black boy? Mr. Roosevelt Regrets.
Thanks, Jennifer. So what are some of the things in this poem that first stand out? Not necessarily the meaning of it, but some phrases that stand out to you, some words, some images. There's no right answer or smart answer. It's just things that struck you in a powerful way.
The sequencing, and they did this, and they did this, and they did this.
This isn't anything concrete, but just the disappointment, like as you read through it.
What are some of the lines that really convey disappointment, Dustin?
Well, just like Allison wrote in the chat there, that the man next to God, so you thought.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think some of the kind of what Melissa referred to, like the repetition, the you and the they is like kind of bounce back and forth. And then the like the sound of that repeated phrase, what'd you get, what'd you get, what'd you get? Like it kind of has this iterative, driving home.
So beyond specific lines, what's your response to the whole poem, and particularly how it relates to the quote from Roosevelt?
There's a definite dichotomy between like how Roosevelt is meeting the situation and how other people are experiencing the situation.
You know that feeling you get when you hear, Mitch McConnell did whatever, and you're like, ugh, of course he did. That's what, like, I feel like this poem is that, ugh, of course he did, like, feeling written out.
I agree. I feel like it could have been written today, except instead of the line regrets, they put in the line thoughts and prayers. Our thoughts and prayers are with you. Change that one thing, and it could have been written in 2020.
Totally, Kathy, that's definitely, when I got to this poem in the collection, I was like, OMG, this is thoughts and prayers. Yeah,
Thoughts and prayers. Yeah, our thoughts and prayers are with you. And that doesn't help in the least.
I think the picture changes it though a little bit for me. I mean, I'm more interested in what the picture says of Roosevelt, Miss Eleanor Roosevelt and the poet together. It almost senses more of a presence together, more solidarity than the words that come about. But so I was drawn more to the picture than what he said. But
I think it's, John, I was thinking similar things, but of course, Eleanor Roosevelt, famously a civil rights icon, much more than her husband. So it's a rebuke, maybe. I don't know who picked the photo, whether that was part of the publication or if that was Max or somebody.
was that you, Max?
That was me. Yep. And part of it, and I think I'm trying to remember if the video that we'll watch later will touch on it, but she did have a friendship with Eleanor Roosevelt that kind of started off as a more of a antagonism. Maybe she refused to stand up when Eleanor Roosevelt came to speak to this group of women that she was working with, and that and the fact that she owned some books that mentioned the word communism got her like kicked out. So she didn't stand up for Eleanor Roosevelt, and she had some socialist books. So that sort of began their friendship.
I see.
I'm sorry. I was just gonna ask why you put the picture in there. I mean, what was, and knowing you, Max, there's some sort of intent behind that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I put it there to the idea that her critique or bitterness didn't mean that she wasn't working with certain people, that she was not a dynamic individual. And also drawing some contrast between Eleanor and Frederick, also. Franklin, not Frederick. I've been reading about Germans all day.
I was going to say that I see a lot of like movement, kind of choreography in the violence, where there's this like kicking back and then clubbing down and then kicking in the stomach, moving forward, and then going down onto the bed. And it's always going in this downward movement, which also reminds me of Deborah and Yael, and that like repetition of the dude that Yael is killing, and like the falling down being mentioned several times. So it kind of makes this last statement of regret the lowest moment of the violence, which I find really poignant.
Wow, yeah, culminating blow.
Yeah, how did and we're going to move on to the next poem soon, another poem soon, but that question of the violence, how did the violence land on folks when hearing this or reading this?
I feel like, unfortunately, this kind of violence has become so everyday that it didn't really land on me.
I would echo that, Dustin. That I was like, well, it's graphic, but yet in a way it's really not anymore to what we hear about, assume, see reality.
It felt truth-telling and not shocking.
Mm-hmm. Totally, and I think there's part of the way she writes the poem. I mean, it's not, at least when I read this, I'm like, there's no surprise. This is like like the day-to-day feeling or response to this like statement that Roosevelt, like, it's even more meaningless because this is a daily occurrence, like that he's not really condemning in a serious way. So because of the many hats that Murray wore, the poems also cover a really wide range of topics, and I want to at least focus on one of her sort of love poems, one of her explicitly like historic responses to a historical event, and then one of her more sort of generally religious / social justice type of poems. So for now, we're going to look at poem number 4 for Pan. It's on, oh, I didn't put page numbers, but it says for big bold numbers for Pan. And this is a poem, I'm not going to say too much about the poem, but the Pan, as in Peter Pan, usually is what is who Murray uses that term as, but also Pan was the kind of nickname she gave one of her lovers and longtime partners, Peggy Holmes, who she met at that same place where she refused to stand up for Eleanor Roosevelt. So would someone be willing to read for Pan? I can do it, and then, but I'll want another person to read it after
Sure.
me.
Max, if you want, I can do, like, it's a long one. I can do part of it. Is my sound okay though? Because mine was freezing up. And that's why I had to leave. Can you, does it come through okay?
Yep.
Do you want me to start it and do like the first 2 portions?
I think,
Or do you want me to do something when you're done? Whatever part when you're done?
yeah, I think for the purpose of this exercise, it's helpful to just hear it all the way through in
Oh,
one.
okay. Sure.
If you'd be willing to read the
Sure.
whole thing, then I can do the second reading.
I'm not a great poetry reader, but I'll read it.
Thanks, Elizabeth.
Do you want me to read the title or just go for it?
Either way.
Okay. For Pan, I did not know when I had climbed the hill past cruel rocks and thorny underbrush that I should find so desolate a place. There land ended on barren cliff, the earth and sea embraced, in perpetual union of tenderness and strife, unyielding stone against relentless wave. There was the loneliness of God, molding the first world in mist and flame. I would have fled the awful emptiness had I not seen you standing there, poised lightly as a gull on swirling surf, bright promontory of defiance, your arms flung windward, your gold or your hair a golden pennant. And though no word was uttered above the tumult of advancing tide, you came uncalled and placed your hand in mine. There on the firmest rim of earth, we stood, my hand in yours, your breath upon my cheek, our wild, impatient dreams, thundering echoes of the flood, our laughter mocking ancient shibboleths, shattering boundaries of space and time. Beloved comrade, high-hearted rebel, if I had paused, let wisdom shield the vulnerable heart, I would have walked a safer path, crept blindly underground, and never glimpsed your shining essence, earth-trapped star on lonely height.
Thank you.
Mhm.
All right, I'll do the second reading. For Pan, I did not know when I had climbed the hill past cruel rocks and thorny underbrush that I should find so desolate a place. There land ended on barren cliff, there earth and sea embraced in perpetual union of tenderness and strife. Unyielding stone against relentless wave. There was the loneliness of God, molding the first world in mist and flame. I would have fled the awful emptiness had I not seen you standing there, poised lightly as a gull on swirling surf, bright promontory of defiance, your arms flung windward, your hair a golden pennant. And though no word was uttered above the tumult of advancing tide, you came uncalled and placed your hand in mine. There on the firmest rim of earth we stood, my hand in yours, your breath upon my cheek, our wild, impatient dreams, thundering echoes of the flood, our laughter mocking ancient shibboleths, shattering boundaries of space and time. Beloved comrade, high-hearted rebel, if I had paused, let wisdom shield the vulnerable heart, I would have walked a safer path, crept blindly underground, and never glimpsed your shining essence, earth-trapped star on lonely height. So I'll ask us to begin the same way and first reflect on words, images, lines that really stood out to you. So what were some words, lines, and images that really stood out to you?
Maybe it's because of Peregrine's mountaintop photo, but I had this sense of place when it was being read, like this climbing up the hill, like perspective. And so there's it starts with this rocky, thorny underbrush, maybe desert kind of feeling, and then moving up to, it seems like, this high place where she encounters this other person, and things like arms flung windward, your hair a golden pennant. It sounds like you're at the top of this mountain and the wind is blowing and the air is clear and maybe cold and you're encountering this other person. So I felt, there's just a strong sense of place.
Yeah, I agree. It's very descriptive. Also sounds though, the thundering surf and all that. Sorry, Elizabeth.
No, that's okay. I was just sort of wanted to echo off Jennifer's point. I think simply just because in our class we've been looking at Ireland and Scotland and that area, that it kind of immediately, because it was connecting kind of these high hills and then the gull and the waters, it was making me think of that area for some reason. So also grounding it in a place, very lovely sounding. But I guess the loneliness of God stood out to me as kind of maybe something that imagery at the beginning with kind of this place that's forming, it kind of makes you think of, at least to me, it made me think of, okay, God making creation and stuff out of the void. And then maybe that echoing, like her or theirs, their own loneliness until they found this person.
Yeah, I thought of the imagery of being on the rock, sort of like at the edge of the void kind of feeling, and this tumultuous space made me think of Psalm 123. Like even when I'm flung out to the ends, you are with me. And Allison, I also loved that passage. And I think because we're in New Testament, we're talking about different kinds of wisdom and foolishness of following certain paths, and how sometimes that's like, there's a lot of wisdom in being foolish and taking risks. I think that one really that really stood out to me also.
So some of the themes that people have already brought up is the relationship between creation and loneliness, with also this sense of love. Did others find the sense of loneliness? How did you hear some of the feelings in this poem?
I'm really moved by the idea of courage leading to this relationship. You know, I would have fled the awful emptiness had I not seen you. And then if I had paused, I would have walked a safer path. And I'm sorry, those last two lines really got me. Never glimpsed your shining essence, earth-trapped star on lonely height. What a tribute.
And hearing you read the last two lines and hearing myself and hearing Elizabeth, there's something very thinking theologically, like incarnation, about those last two lines for me. This idea, not necessarily only in a Christian perspective, of course she's coming from Christian perspective, but this idea of a star on earth, or like in this earthy scene, I find very powerful. One thing I wanted to ask Elizabeth, you mentioned this idea of sort of God and loneliness and creation, and I wonder if you would talk a little bit more about that idea of sort of lonely God.
I mean, I could try. That could just be my like own weird perception as someone who really hasn't dived into any significant theology class yet, but just maybe for me it stood out because it just thinking of the idea of, okay, if you're thinking of the Trinity and the relationship and that, I don't know what other people's backgrounds would say about the idea of us as humans being created for relationship. So I think it comes out of that and just the idea of, okay, at least in my background, there's a lot of teaching of this idea of like, okay, God doesn't really need us, but wants us. And again, it's kind of out of like not, I don't know, maybe my own perception of thinking maybe there was some loneliness. Maybe there was, sure, the Trinity, but that's why we're here. And so it was kind of out of the reason why I'm creating anything out of that void. Maybe there is a possibility there was God's own loneliness for something. So that's kind of maybe where I'm coming from with what it made me think of right away. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Are there any further comments before we move to one last poem for today?
I wasn't going to say this, but I've been deep in thinking about the Transfiguration because for this week. And when I heard the first line of the poem, I did not know when I'd climbed the hill. And then I go to the end, the part that someone else pointed out, and never glimpsed your shiny essence, earth-trapped star on lonely height. It kind of reminded me of some things I've been reading about the Transfiguration, how we incorporate that into life today, and the idea that we get to go up to the mountain maybe, or some people got to go up the mountain, but we have to come back down. And that I don't know. I don't have anything specific, but it's having me connected to those thoughts.
For me, it feels like the way Glennon Doyle describes seeing Abby Wambach in her book Untamed, where she sees her across the room and says like, there she is, and just stands up and opens her arms wide. And I love that picture of having her arms flung windward. So it created that picture in my mind in Glennon's narrative of their meeting.
Wow, thanks, Elena. So let's move this last poem we'll talk about, but you have this document now, so you can look at some of her other poems. I also really recommend the collection. It's really beautiful. But we'll look at the poem Prophecy. So it's number 2. And I might just call on people. I might just call on Stephanie right now, because recently you got annoyed at me for not calling on you to read poetry.
I knew you were gonna pick me. I accept. Prophecy. I sing of a new American, separate from others, yet enlarged and diminished by all others. I am the child of kings and serfs, freemen and slaves, having neither superiors nor inferiors, progeny of all colors, all cultures, all systems, all beliefs. I have been enslaved, yet my spirit is unbound. I have been cast aside, but I sparkle in the darkness. I have been slain, but live on the rivers of history. I seek no conquest, no wealth, no power, no revenge. I seek only discovery of the illimitable heights and depths of my own being.
Thanks, Stephanie. Is someone willing to read this a second time?
Sure. All right. Prophecy. I sing of a new American, separate from all others, yet enlarged and diminished by all others. I am the child of kings and serfs, freemen and slaves, having neither superiors nor inferiors, progeny of all colors, all cultures, all systems, all beliefs. I have been enslaved, yet my spirit is unbound. I have been cast aside, but I sparkle in the darkness. I have been slain, but live on in the rivers of history. I seek no conquest, no wealth, no power, no revenge. I seek only discovery of the illimitable heights and depths of my own being.
Thanks, Allison. So again, this is the routine. What are some lines, some images, some words that stood out to you? And you can say it out loud. You can also feel free to use the chat or both.
I am the child of kings and serfs, freemen and slaves, having neither superiors nor inferiors.
But I sparkle in the darkness.
I love that line for the sound of it. Sparkle and darkness together. The K sounds together are, what do you call that? Where a thing sounds like what it is a little bit.
Yeah.
Thank you.
The power of that line to me is in the I've been cast aside, but I sparkle in darkness.
Yeah, there's so much agency in the way they're sparkling despite that, you know.
I just have to name that it kind of has like the apophatic vibe of like, I'm this, I'm also this. So pseudo D is always the right answer, but it is genuinely conjuring that kind of like, even in the like the cadence of it, negating itself as it comes out.
Something I'm noticing, and I think it relates to that apophatic sort of theme, is that this poem, like the last poem, like the first poem, which are, they're each from a different like section of the book, which is also fun. But like there's a lot of ands that kind of travel between different extremes or different dualities. So there's like tenderness and strife in the last poem, and then here there's bridging these like this for instance, yeah, I've been cast
The
aside.
polar opposites.
Exactly. And her moving between those, and I read this with a lot of, or it sounded like there was a lot of movement when Allison and Stephanie were reading this, between this and that, like a kind of rocking.
And not just opposites of things, but of words like progeny of all colors, all cultures, all systems, all beliefs, but no conquest, no wealth, no power, no revenge. So that, and that comes up at the very end. that really amazing, illimitable heights and depths of my own being.
So in just a second, we're gonna switch over to watch a video about this upcoming documentary about Pauli Murray. But I just want to go around the Zoom room and just from what we've read, there wasn't too much biographical information. There were some snippets. If we could all go around and say one word that we might think of in relation to Pauli Murray based on this reading. So about maybe who Pauli Murray was based on these poems. And I can go first. I'll say liminal.
I would say independent.
I would say discoverer.
I would say subversive.
Truth teller.
I would say prophetic.
Say alive.
I would probably say courageous, especially in the second poem we read.
Sparkling.
Uncovering.
And if you don't want to speak out loud in the space, also feel free to